She worked through the pain, her left hand bound tightly in rough bandages, the kind that spoke of an injury still raw and unhealed. With her good arm she carried heavy trays, balancing mugs of coffee and plates of eggs as though her very survival depended on it. The customers noticed, whispering among themselves, some pitying her, others shaking their heads. But none dared speak up as her manager barked orders loud enough for the whole diner to hear. Every mistake she made was met with ridicule, every stumble with a smirk that seemed designed to break her spirit. But she did not stop. She could not. Rent waited. Bills pressed. Life left her no other choice. And in the corner, a man watched. He wasn't who they thought he was, and what he uncovered would change everything inside this diner. What he discovered left him stunned, and the world around him shaken. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Denise Carter was no ordinary waitress. She carried a broken hand wrapped tightly in bandages, yet still managed to keep the diner moving, her smile hiding the pain that never seemed to leave her face. Ross, the manager, was relentless, always the first to mock her in front of customers, always the one who seemed to enjoy her struggle rather than offer help. And in the far corner sat Harold Whitman, a man most dismissed as just another quiet veteran sipping his coffee in peace. But Harold was not there by accident, and he was not who anyone believed him to be. As the minutes passed, questions began to rise in the shadows of that small-town diner. Was Denise simply clumsy, as Ross insisted, or was there more behind her injury? Why did her eyes flicker with something deeper than exhaustion whenever Ross stepped too close? And why did the manager seem so desperate to silence her, as though he feared what she might reveal? The truth was buried in plain sight, and every whisper, every glance, every cruel word carried pieces of a story that none of the customers could yet see. What Harold would uncover in the days that followed would not only expose Ross, but would reveal a chain of events darker than anyone sitting in that diner could have imagined. Denise Carter had never been the kind of woman who expected life to hand her anything easily. She worked 2 jobs before landing at the diner, always chasing the same thing: stability. Rent came due every month without mercy, utility bills stacked one after another, and groceries cost more than she could ever plan for. Still, she showed up, apron tied, hair pulled back, forcing a smile that customers took as effortless but which cost her everything she had left inside. Denise dreamed of something simpler, a small place to call her own, maybe a chance at a future without the constant grind, but the world seemed determined to keep her on her knees. Ross, her manager, was part of that world. To the casual eye, Ross appeared confident, even charming, cracking jokes with regulars, handing out free coffee refills, pretending to be the kind of man who kept the place alive. But when the laughter faded and the door shut behind the last customer, his charm dissolved into cruelty. Behind closed doors, Ross was ruthless, cutting down his staff with words sharper than knives, and for Denise, his favorite target. Every shift felt like walking into a battlefield where the enemy was waiting with a grin. Harold Whitman, on the other hand, seemed like a relic of another time, the kind of man who kept to himself, who stirred his coffee slowly and tipped generously without ever drawing attention. Most people saw a quiet old veteran, the type who carried decades of untold stories in the way he sat straight-backed even when alone. But Harold was far more than that. He was an old-school businessman who had once built companies with his bare hands and ran them with principles others abandoned long ago. Honor mattered to Harold. Integrity was not just a word, but a code that had shaped his entire life. And so when he sat in that diner booth day after day, sipping his coffee and observing, he was not just watching, he was weighing, he was testing, he was searching for the truth that only shows itself when people believe no one important is looking. For Denise, the truth came late one night, long after the last customer had left, when the clatter of dishes had faded and the neon lights hummed quietly against the window. She was cleaning tables, her hands raw from soap and scrubbing, when she heard Ross's voice carry through the thin door of the office. At first, she thought he was on the phone, laughing about something trivial. But then the words reached her clearly. Money missing from the register, easy cash slipping into his pocket. The arrogance of a man who believed no one would dare challenge him. Denise froze, cloth in hand, her heart racing. She hadn't meant to listen, but once she did, she couldn't stop. She pressed closer to the door, each word confirming what she feared. Ross was stealing. And worse, he was proud of it. When she stepped back into the hallway, her breath quick and uneven, Ross was already there, his shadow filling the space before she could escape. The smirk he wore wasn't playful anymore. It was the smile of a man who had been caught and who wouldn't let the truth live to see the morning. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a force that made her gasp. Then came the crack, sharp, unforgiving. Pain lit through her body as she crumpled to the floor, her wrist twisted and broken. Ross leaned down, his voice low and venomous. "Clumsy, huh? Better keep it that way. Say a word about what you heard, and you won't just lose your job." The warning wasn't just spoken, it was branded into her bones. From that night forward, Denise carried the weight of silence with her. Every time Ross mocked her in front of customers, every time he called her clumsy, every time he smirked while she struggled to lift plates with one good hand, she knew it wasn't just cruelty. It was control. It was the reminder of what he had done, of what he could do again if she dared speak the truth. And still, Denise did not quit. For her, quitting wasn't an option. Rent didn't wait. Bills didn't care. But silence came at a cost, and day by day that cost was breaking her down. And all the while, from the corner booth, Harold Whitman kept watching. The morning rush was always the hardest for Denise Carter. Plates stacked high on her good arm, mugs of steaming coffee pressed against her hip, menus tucked between her fingers. She moved between tables with a quiet determination that only those who had lived through hardship could understand. Her injured hand, still bound in rough bandages, dangled uselessly by her side, a constant reminder of the night everything changed. Customers noticed her limp movements, the slight wince that crossed her face when she carried too much, but most said nothing. A few whispered, others shook their heads in pity, but all of them knew the voice that cut through the air belonged to Ross. Ross stood by the register like a king over his kingdom, barking orders, rolling his eyes, calling her out for mistakes that barely existed. "Pick it up, Denise," he snapped, loud enough for every booth to hear. "Don't keep people waiting. This isn't charity." His words struck like whips, and though some customers shifted uncomfortably, none dared intervene. To them, he was the manager. To Denise, he was the warden of a prison she couldn't leave. But behind Denise's tired smile, behind the trembling of her good arm as she balanced tray after tray, was a memory that refused to fade. It played like a film in her mind, whenever Ross's voice rose above the clinking of cutlery. That night, that office, that crack. It had started innocently, just a shift that had run too late, the diner nearly empty, the lights flickering against the windows. Denise had been wiping down tables, her apron damp, her back aching, when she heard laughter from behind the office door. At first she paid no mind, until the words slipped through like poison. "Another 500 gone, easy," Ross's voice echoed. "They'll never notice." Denise froze, her cloth hovering over a table already spotless. She edged closer, heart pounding, pressing her ear against the thin wood. "Easy, Cash," he said again, pride dripping from every word. "They think I keep this place running, but it's running me richer than they'll ever guess." Denise pulled back, her pulse hammering in her throat. She hadn't meant to overhear, but once the truth reached her, she couldn't erase it. She turned to slip away, but the office door swung open, and Ross stood in the hallway. His smile was gone. His eyes, sharp and dangerous, locked on her. Before she could speak, his hand shot out, clamping onto her wrist. The pain was immediate, his grip twisting until bone gave way with a sickening crack. Denise gasped, dropping to her knees, her body folding under the weight of agony. Ross leaned down, his voice low, each word a dagger. "Clumsy, huh? Better keep it that way. Say one word about what you heard and you won't just lose your job." He let her go, the smirk returning as if nothing had happened, leaving her on the floor with tears streaking her face and a wrist that would never be the same. Now, every time Ross mocked her in front of customers, every time he sneered at her pace or rolled his eyes at her service, Denise felt that crack again. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. She carried trays, endured his jeers, and whispered apologies to customers when his cruelty spilled into their meals. The bandages on her wrist weren't just hiding an injury, they were hiding the truth. And yet, while Ross strutted and laughed, while Denise forced herself to keep going, something else lingered in the background. From the corner booth, Harold Whitman stirred his coffee slowly, his gaze fixed, his silence deliberate. He had seen men like Ross before, men who wielded power through fear, men who built their own kingdoms on intimidation and greed. To Ross, Harold was just another customer, an old man wasting time over eggs and burnt coffee. To Harold, every word, every cruel laugh, every staged write-up against Denise was evidence. Ross believed he had silenced her. He believed the broken wrist had sealed her lips forever. But what Ross didn't know was that every cruel word, every staged write-up was being watched. Harold Whitman had built a life on discipline. As a veteran and a businessman, he had learned that truth was rarely spoken openly. It was shown in patterns, in details that most people ignored. And so he sat, day after day, in the corner booth of his own diner, watching the rhythms of the place he had quietly entrusted to others. He knew every sound, the hiss of the grill, the clatter of plates, the murmur of conversations. But now he listened differently. He was listening for Ross. He was watching Denise Carter. It did not take long for Harold to see a pattern. Ross never missed an opportunity to humiliate Denise. If she moved too slowly, he called her careless. If she poured coffee with her good hand and spilled a drop, he exaggerated the mistake, making sure every customer within earshot knew she had failed. If another waitress forgot an order, Ross laughed it off, brushed it aside. But when Denise carried trays with one arm and faltered, his grin widened like a predator who had cornered his prey. Harold kept silent, his jaw tightening, his coffee cooling in front of him, but his mind was turning. Ross played a clever game with appearances. To customers, he could still turn on the charm, handing out extra napkins with a smile, joking loudly with regulars, sometimes even claiming, "Denise's got 2 left feet, bless her heart," always dropping something. Some customers chuckled awkwardly, nodding along as if Ross's words explained what they saw. And in those moments, Denise stood quiet, her lips pressed into a faint line, her good hand trembling as she picked up a fallen fork or wiped a counter for the second time. To the untrained eye, she looked exactly as Ross described, clumsy, unlucky, overwhelmed. But Harold Whitman had seen enough people in his life to know when a story didn't add up. He began to look closer, not at Denise, but at the paper trail that Ross thought no one cared about. One afternoon, Harold excused himself, asking casually for the restroom. Instead, his boots carried him down the narrow hallway to Ross's office. The door was ajar, papers scattered across the desk in careless stacks. Harold stepped inside quietly, his eyes sweeping the room. He saw them immediately, reports, all with the same name written across the top in bold letters, Denise Carter. Page after page accused her of every petty mistake imaginable. Spilled drinks, forgotten orders, bad attitude. Harold frowned. He had eaten in that diner almost every day for months, and never once had he seen Denise display a bad attitude. She worked harder than anyone else on the floor. The reports smelled of lies. Then Harold's gaze shifted to a second pile of papers. These were register tallies, columns of numbers that dipped and fluctuated without reason. Years in business had trained Harold's eye. He didn't need a calculator to see the theft in front of him. Every week, cash disappeared, but the reports never mentioned it. Ross was skimming money right under everyone's nose, and worse, he was building a paper trail that pointed to Denise as the problem. The theft was deliberate, but the cover-up was cruelty sharpened to a point. Harold folded the top page, slipping it into his jacket before leaving as quietly as he had come. Still, doubts crept in. Ross was smooth when he wanted to be. Customers laughed at his jokes. Some even seemed to believe his stories about Denise being slow or unfit for the job. It would have been easy for Harold to dismiss it all as harsh management. Easy to believe Denise was just unlucky. But every time he thought of letting it go, he saw the way Denise's eyes flickered when Ross passed behind her. The way she flinched when he barked her name. The way her bandaged hand trembled when she carried more than her body could bear. Those were not the marks of clumsiness. They were the marks of fear. The confirmation Harold needed came one late evening. He stayed longer than usual, sipping his coffee in silence as the diner emptied. The last of the customers left, the door chimed shut, and Ross retreated to his office with one of his drinking buddies. Harold remained in the shadows, listening. The office door didn't close fully, and their voices carried into the hallway. Ross's laugh came first, loud, unguarded. "Another $5,000 easy," he boasted, his words slurred with satisfaction. "They'll never catch on. And if they do, well, Denise already looks like the problem. I've got the paperwork to prove it." His friend snorted, muttering something Harold couldn't make out, but Ross answered, his tone dropping darker. "She won't talk. Not with that hand. I made sure of it." Harold froze, his fingers tightening around the coffee mug he still held. The air seemed to thicken around him. Ross's words weren't just arrogance. They were a confession. The broken hand, the false reports, the missing money. It was all connected, all orchestrated. Ross hadn't just silenced Denise. He had built an entire story that painted her as the villain while he lined his own pockets. Harold's instincts, the same instincts that had carried him through war and business alike, surged back to life. Ross thought he was untouchable. But Harold Whitman knew better. He knew the time for watching was over. Harold Whitman was not a man who acted quickly, but when he did, he acted with precision. After hearing Ross brag in the office, after holding in his hands the paperwork that framed Denise Carter as incompetent, while hiding theft that Ross himself orchestrated, Harold knew the time had come. He had spent weeks watching, listening, collecting pieces of a puzzle that no one else had cared to see. Now the picture was clear. He called the police quietly that evening, not revealing who he was, not explaining everything yet. He simply gave enough for them to be ready, and then he waited. The next morning, the diner looked no different. The air still smelled of burnt coffee and bacon grease. The chatter of customers still filled the room. The clink of forks and plates played like background music. Denise Carter was there as always, moving through the pain with her good arm, her bandaged hand stiff at her side. Ross was there too, strutting behind the counter, laughing at jokes on his phone, and looking for any excuse to cut Denise down again. Harold sat in his usual corner booth, the same old veteran with his denim jacket and black coffee, the man no one paid attention to. But inside, Harold's silence carried weight. He was not there as a customer. He was there to finish this. Ross did not disappoint. By mid-morning, as the diner grew crowded, Denise carried a heavy stack of plates across the floor. Her good arm trembled under the weight, her wrist pulling against the bandages. A glass slid too close to the edge of the tray and fell with a crash, shattering on the tile. The diner went still for a moment. And then Ross's voice cut through the silence, sharp and mocking. "Clumsy again, Denise? Always making a mess. I don't know why I keep you around." His grin spread wide, his words loud enough for every customer to hear. A few people muttered under their breath, one or two even chuckled uncomfortably, but most lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet Denise's gaze. Denise knelt to pick up the shards with her good hand, her cheeks burning red, the sting of humiliation sharper than the broken glass. Ross leaned against the counter, arms folded, savoring the moment like a predator circling prey. But this time, someone else moved. Harold Whitman lifted his spoon and tapped it gently against his coffee cup. Once, twice. The soft metallic ring carried through the diner, strange and unexpected, pulling every eye toward him. Conversation stopped. Forks froze midair. Denise straightened slowly, glass still trembling in her palm, her eyes fixed on the quiet man in the corner who, for the first time, commanded the room. Ross laughed nervously, trying to break the silence. "What is this, Harold? You writing a book about my diner?" His voice held a false confidence, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a flash of something he had not shown before. Uncertainty. Harold's gaze locked on Ross, steady and unyielding. His voice, when it came, was calm but carried a weight that silenced the room further. "This isn't your diner, Ross. It's mine, and I know everything you've done." The words struck like thunder. Gasps rippled across the booths. A fork clattered onto a plate. Denise's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock as she realized the man she thought was just another customer had been watching her all along, not as a stranger but as the owner of the very place she worked. Ross's smirk faltered, his face draining pale. You're joking," he stammered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You're not serious." Harold stood, his shoulders squared with the quiet strength of a man who had faced battles far greater than this. He pulled a folder from beneath his jacket and placed it firmly on the counter. Papers spilled out across the surface, misconduct reports with Denise's name scrawled falsely at the top, financial sheets that revealed theft, tally sheets that never balanced. Each page was proof, each word a nail in the coffin of Ross's lies. The customers leaned forward, murmuring. The two women in business suits from table 3 exchanged a glance, whispering, "I knew it. I knew something wasn't right." A man at the counter shook his head, muttering under his breath, "All this time, and we didn't see it." Harold's voice cut through the noise, calm but sharp. "I've sat here long enough to see who you really are, Ross. Every false report you wrote against Denise Carter, every dollar you stole from the register, every cruel word meant to cover your guilt. I know it all, and so will they." He nodded toward the door, where 2 uniformed officers had just stepped inside, their presence commanding the room as much as Harold's words. Ross's bravado cracked. Wait, this is ridiculous," he sputtered, his hands rising slightly as though he could push the truth back. "You can't prove anything." But the folder on the counter said otherwise, and so did the fear now flashing across his face. The diner, once a place of chatter and clinking dishes, was now silent, every pair of eyes fixed on the man who had mocked and abused without consequence. The stage was set, the lies laid bare, and Ross, for the first time, was no longer in control. The officers stepped further into the diner, their boots heavy against the tile floor, the metallic clink of handcuffs echoing faintly at their belts. Ross's smirk was gone now, replaced by a sheen of sweat that glistened under the fluorescent lights. He glanced from Harold Whitman to the folder of documents sprawled across the counter, then to the crowd of customers whose eyes no longer held respect or amusement but disgust. "This is a mistake," he stammered, his voice cracking as the officers closed in. "You can't arrest me. I've done nothing wrong." But his protests carried no weight. The evidence lay in plain sight. One officer read him his rights while the other clasped the cold steel cuffs around his wrists. The sound of metal snapping shut was louder than any of Ross's denials. The diner, which had once endured his laughter and his cruelty, now filled with the murmur of disbelief and the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice finally arrive. Ross struggled, his voice rising in desperation. "Wait, you don't understand. She's clumsy. She's the problem. But his words were drowned out by the shift in the room. No one believed him anymore. The mask had fallen, and what remained was a man exposed for what he truly was. Denise Carter stood frozen, her good hand pressed against her chest, her breath caught somewhere between shock and relief. For so long she had carried the burden of silence, enduring the whispers, the humiliation, the pain that radiated from her broken wrist. For so long she had believed that no one would ever see the truth, that her suffering was hers alone to bear. Now, in the space of a few minutes, the weight began to lift. Harold Whitman turned toward her, his voice softer now, carrying not the sharp edge of accusation, but the steady warmth of recognition. You've carried this place on your back, Denise. While others lied about you, you kept it running. From today forward, you're not just a waitress. You're the new floor supervisor. The words hung in the air for a moment, and then the room erupted, not in chaos but in applause. Customers clapped, some softly, others loud enough that it echoed off the diner walls. The two women in business suits who had whispered about her injury smiled through tears. A man at the counter shook his head, muttering, "It's about time." Denise pressed her trembling hand against her lips, a muffled sob escaping as tears rolled freely down her cheeks. It was not just relief. It was the sound of years of pain finally breaking apart, replaced with something she had almost forgotten she could feel: dignity. Ross was led out the door, his protests fading as the police car swallowed him into the night. The sound of the diner shifted once more. It still smelled of burnt coffee and bacon grease. The fluorescent lights still buzzed faintly above, but the air itself felt lighter, as though a storm cloud had lifted after years of shadow. Harold returned to his booth, sitting quietly with his coffee now cooling in front of him. For a long time, he simply watched the room, not as an owner hidden in plain sight, but as a man who had seen truth surface in the most unexpected way. His eyes lingered on Denise, now standing taller than before, wiping tears from her face but holding her shoulders straight, her expression no longer one of defeat, but of quiet triumph. For years, Denise Carter carried pain in silence. She endured cruelty, she shouldered lies, and she bore the cost of truth hidden behind fear. But in the end, truth spoke louder than cruelty, and justice found its way, in the most unexpected corner booth. For those who watched her struggle, the lesson was clear. Strength is not always loud. Resilience is not always visible. Sometimes it is the quiet endurance of a woman who refuses to quit, even when the world conspires against her. And sometimes justice does not come from the powerful or the loudest voice in the room, but from the watchful eyes of someone who refuses to look away. The bigger takeaway is this: trust matters. Resilience carries weight, and justice, though delayed, is never truly gone. Denise Carter's story reminds us all that even in places where cruelty thrives unchecked, truth has a way of rising, and when it does, it demands to be heard.